The air in the great hall of Shushan was thick with the scent of cedar and the heavy perfume of 1,000 blossoms. Gold glinted from every surface, catching the light from tall, narrow windows. Outside, the midday sun beat down on the dusty plains of Persia, but here, within the palace, a cool hush prevailed, broken only by the rustle of silk and the soft murmur of courtiers. King Ahasuerus, ruler of 127 provinces, from India to Kush, sat upon his massive throne, a figure of remote, almost divine authority. His eyes, though, were fixed on something small, almost invisible, at the edge of his vision. A scroll, freshly sealed, carried by a messenger with a face like stone. The decree it contained was simple, yet its implications were vast, says an invisible blade sharpened to cut through the very fabric of an ancient people. He signed it with a flourish, oblivious to the quiet ripple of terror it would soon unleash across his sprawling empire. This was the world into which our story steps, a world of absolute power and profound vulnerability. How did 4 individuals, born into a people often dispersed and dispossessed, rise to command such immense power within such empires, and what did they do with it? What kind of power could shape the destiny of millions, not through armies or conquest, but through wit, influence, and an unshakable will? This is not a story of kings and conquerors in the usual sense. It is a story of those who, from the shadows or from unexpected positions, bent the arc of history to their will, leaving legacies that echo even today. Our journey begins not with a warrior, but with a queen whose very identity was a secret, a gamble, a whispered hope. Her name was Esther. She was an orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai in the Jewish quarter of Shushan, a girl of striking beauty and quiet strength. When the king sought a new queen, after banishing Vashti, Esther, among countless others, was brought to the palace. She found favour in the king's eyes, not knowing the immense burden of destiny that would soon fall upon her delicate shoulders. She became Queen Esther, but her heritage, her people, remained hidden, a secret held close by Mordecai's careful counsel. Then came the decree, the very one the king had signed in that gilded hall. It was the brainchild of Haman, the king's highest official, a man consumed by a petty rage against Mordecai, who refused to bow to him. Haman convinced the king that a certain people, scattered throughout the provinces, had laws different from all other peoples and did not keep the king's laws. He proposed their annihilation, all of them, from young to old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month. For this he offered 10,000 talents of silver to the royal treasury, a staggering sum, a price placed on the lives of an entire nation. The decree was sealed with the king's signet ring and dispatched by swift riders to every corner of the empire. When Mordecai heard, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. The news reached Esther through her attendants. Distressed, she sent clothes for Mordecai, but he refused them. He then sent her a copy of the decree, explaining Haman's plot in grim detail, and charged her with an impossible task: go to the king, plead for her people. Esther's blood ran cold. To enter the king's inner court without being summoned was an act punishable by death, unless the king extended his golden scepter. She had not been called to the king for 30 days. Her life, and the lives of her people, hung by the thinnest thread. Mordecai's reply was stark, cutting through her fear. Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? His words pierced her soul, a call to a destiny she could no longer ignore. She sent word back, gather all the Jews in Shushan, fast for me for 3 days, night or day, and I and my young women will also fast. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. A silence fell over the palace, a heavy quiet charged with prayer and dread. 3 days later, dressed in her royal robes, Esther walked through the vast corridors, her heart pounding against her ribs, towards the inner court where the king sat on his throne. She was about to step into the light, risking everything. Before we go further, where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. And if this story already has you hooked, subscribe now. Every episode hits like this. Esther stood at the threshold, the weight of a people on her shoulders, about to face the man who held her fate, and theirs, in his hand. Would the golden scepter extend, or would her journey end here, a silent tragedy swallowed by the opulence of the Persian court? The air in the inner court was still, almost breathless. Esther, resplendent in her royal apparel, stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the distant figure of King Ahasuerus. The king, accustomed to flattery and grand displays, must have noticed the stark simplicity of her presence, the quiet courage that radiated from her. He saw her, and something stirred within him. Perhaps it was her beauty, perhaps the sheer audacity of her appearance, or perhaps a flicker of memory of the gentle queen he had chosen. Slowly, deliberately, he extended the golden scepter. A collective sigh of relief, unheard but deeply felt, echoed through the unseen corridors of history. Esther was safe for now. "What is your wish, Queen Esther?" the king asked, his voice resonating through the vast space. "What is your request? It shall be granted you, even to half of my kingdom." A grand promise spoken casually by a man who possessed a world. But Esther did not ask for half his kingdom. She asked for something far more subtle, far more dangerous. "If it pleases the king," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart, "let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for him." A banquet. Not a plea, not an accusation, but an invitation to a feast. This was not the act of a desperate woman. This was the opening move of a master strategist. She understood the psychology of power, the slow dance of influence. Haman, swelling with pride at the queen's singular invitation, was oblivious to the trap being laid. And he went home that day, boasting to his wife Zeresh and his friends about his riches, his many sons, and how the king had promoted him above all other officials. But even amidst his boasting, a shadow fell. "Yet all this is worth nothing to me," he declared, "whenever I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." His wife and friends, eager to please, suggested building a gallows 50 cubits high and asking the king in the morning for permission to hang Mordecai on it. Haman, delighted, ordered the gallows built. The stage was set not just for a banquet, but for a reckoning. That night the king could not sleep. Perhaps it was the richness of the queen's first banquet, or perhaps a divine unease stirred in his soul. He commanded that the book of memorable deeds, the chronicles of the kingdom, be brought and read before him. And there, amidst the records of ancient victories and forgotten decrees, a passage was read aloud. It detailed how Mordecai had once uncovered a plot by 2 of the king's eunuchs to assassinate Ahasuerus. The king asked, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" His servants replied, "Nothing has been done for him." A detail easily overlooked now shone with the clarity of a spotlight. The king felt a prick of conscience, a sudden awareness of an injustice. At that very moment, Haman entered the outer court, ready to ask the king for permission to hang Mordecai. The timing was impeccable, almost impossibly so. The king, still pondering the injustice, asked his courtiers, "Who is in the court?" They replied, "Haman is standing in the court." "Let him come in," the king commanded. Haman entered, his heart undoubtedly pounding with anticipation of Mordecai's demise. But the king spoke first. "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Haman, in his boundless arrogance, thought only of himself. Surely the king meant him. So he described a magnificent procession. Royal robes, a royal horse, a royal crown, led through the city square by one of the king's most noble officials, proclaiming, "Thus it is done for the man whom the king delights to honor." The king listened, his face inscrutable. Then he delivered the command that must have shattered Haman's world. "Make haste, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing of all that you have mentioned." Haman, the architect of a genocide, the man who had ordered gallows built for Mordecai, was now forced to lead his hated rival through the city, proclaiming his honor. The humiliation must have been absolute, a bitter taste of his own poison. He returned home, utterly disgraced, covering his head in shame. His wife and wise men, seeing the turn of events, offered a chilling prophecy. "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." Before they had even finished speaking, the king's eunuchs arrived, rushing Haman to the second banquet Esther had prepared. He walked into that feast, a man already broken, unaware that the queen had one more, even more devastating revelation to make. The grand stage of power was about to become a crucible of truth, and Haman was about to face the queen's final devastating move. The fate of a people and the legacy of one man hung in the balance, poised on the edge of a queen's whispered words. The second banquet was a study in contrasts. The same opulent hall, the same rich aromas, but an undercurrent of tension now hummed beneath the surface. King Ahasuerus and Haman sat at the table, but Esther, no longer just a beautiful queen, was now a woman preparing to unleash a storm. The king, still perhaps troubled by his sleepless night and the strange turn of events involving Mordecai, again asked, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be performed." This time Esther did not delay. The moment had arrived. "If I have found favour in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my petition, and my people for my request." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken weight. The king, startled, could not have anticipated this. A threat to the queen's life? And to her people? "Who is he? And where is he? Who has dared to do this?" he demanded, his voice rising, a tremor of genuine anger now replacing his earlier cordiality. Esther, looking directly at Haman, delivered her devastating accusation. "An adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. Haman, who only hours before had been parading Mordecai through the city, now stood exposed, condemned by the very queen he had sought to impress. His face must have drained of colour, his legs turning to water. The king, furious and confused, had rose from the banquet and stormed out into the palace garden, trying to process the enormity of Esther's revelation. His queen, his beloved Esther, was one of them, and Haman, his trusted vizier, had plotted to destroy her and her entire people. The betrayal was staggering. Left alone with Esther, Haman, now desperate, threw himself upon the couch where the queen was reclining, begging for his life. In that moment, the king returned from the garden and saw Haman prostrate on Esther's couch. The sight, perhaps misinterpreted, perhaps simply the final straw in a torrent of rage, ignited a fresh fury. "Will he even assault the queen in my presence? In my own house?" the king roared. The words were barely out of his mouth when the king's attendants, sensing the shift in power, immediately covered Haman's face, done a symbolic gesture of his impending doom. Then, Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, spoke up, adding a final damning detail. "Behold, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king, stands at Haman's house." The gallows, built for one, would now serve another. "Hang him on it," the king commanded. And so Haman was hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Justice, swift and poetic, had been served. The king's wrath was appeased, but the decree, the terrible decree to annihilate the Jews, still stood. It was sealed with the king's signet ring, and according to Persian law, a decree sealed by the king could not be revoked. This was the critical dilemma. The immediate threat was gone, but the long shadow of the law remained. That same day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, all his vast wealth and property. Mordecai, Esther's cousin, was brought before the king, for Esther had revealed who he was and their kinship. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. Esther appointed Mordecai over Haman's estate, but Esther was not content. The lives of her people were still in peril. She again spoke before the king, falling at his feet and weeping, pleading with him to avert the evil plot of Haman and revoke the letters he had sent. "How can I endure to see the disaster that will come upon my people? How can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" The king could not revoke the decree, but he could issue a new one. "Write as you please with regard to the Jews in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be revoked." So, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, Mordecai wrote new letters. These letters were sent to all the Jews, to the satraps, governors, and officials of the 127 provinces. They granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, along with their wives and children, and to plunder their goods. The day appointed for this was the very same day the original decree had set for their destruction, the 13th day of the 12th month. From despair, a new hope had emerged. From the brink of annihilation, a people were granted the right to fight for their survival. The tide had turned, not through military might, but through the courage of a queen and the cunning of her cousin. But the battle was not yet won. The day of reckoning was still to come, and the empire, divided by two opposing decrees, braced itself for a confrontation unlike any other. What would happen when those two decrees clashed in every city, in every province, across the vast Persian Empire? The empire held its breath. For months, the two decrees travelled across the vast Persian lands, creating an unprecedented tension. The first decree, Haman's decree, commanded the annihilation of the Jews on a specific day. The second, Mordecai's decree, granted the Jews the right to defend themselves and destroy any who attacked them on that very same day. Fear and confusion rippled through the provinces. Who would prevail? Which decree would hold sway in the hearts and minds of the populace? As the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, approached, the situation was precarious. But something remarkable began to happen. The fear that Haman had intended for the Jews now fell upon their enemies. The officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the royal officers all began to help the Jews. Why? Because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. Mordecai, the very man Haman had sought to hang, was now second in command to King Ahasuerus, powerful in the palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. He grew ever more powerful, and the officials saw it. They knew where true power now lay. On that fateful day, the 13th of Adar, the Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. No one could withstand them, for the fear of them had fallen upon all peoples. In Shushan, the capital, the Jews struck down 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman, whose names were Pashandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaizatha. These names, recited through generations, became a litany of vengeance and a symbol of their deliverance. When the king heard the report from Shushan, he asked Queen Esther, "In Shushan the citadel the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." Esther, ever vigilant, asked for one more day for the Jews in Shushan to carry out the decree, and that Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. The king commanded it to be done. So on the 14th day of Adar, the Jews in Shushan killed 300 more men. Across the other provinces, on the 13th day of Adar, the Jews gathered and stood for their lives. They struck down 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hand on the plunder. This detail is crucial. It wasn't about greed or conquest. It was about survival, about self-defense. They rested on the 14th day and made it a day of feasting and gladness. The Jews in Shushan, who fought for 2 days, rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Mordecai then sent letters to all the Jews throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, enjoining them to keep the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar every year as days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. This was to commemorate the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday. This then was the birth of Purim, a festival that has been celebrated for over 2,400 years, a vibrant, joyous holiday that recalls a moment of profound vulnerability turned into triumphant deliverance. It is a testament to the power of courage, strategy, and the unexpected turns of history. Mordecai the Jew rose to become second to King Ahasuerus, great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all their offspring. He was not a king, nor a prophet, but a statesman, a survivor who, alongside Esther, shaped the destiny of a people and established a legacy of resilience. The story of Esther and Mordecai is a powerful illustration of how individuals, even in the most perilous circumstances, can wield immense influence. They did not lead armies, but they navigated the treacherous currents of imperial power, turning a decree of annihilation into a decree of salvation. Their rise was not an accident, but a testament to their unwavering commitment to their people and their astute understanding of the mechanisms of power. But they were not the only ones. The tapestry of history holds other figures, equally remarkable, who stood at the crossroads of empires and destinies. Their stories too speak of a different kind of power, a power that shapes civilizations and echoes through millennia. And with that, we turn our gaze to another era, another empire, and another extraordinary individual whose influence would stretch far beyond his own lifetime. Esther and Mordecai's story is a vivid testament to the power of influence within an empire, a tale of survival and strategic brilliance. But what happens when the very empire itself crumbles? What kind of power can endure the collapse of civilizations, shaping not just a generation, but the course of millennia? This brings us to another figure, one whose influence was less about saving a people from immediate destruction, and more about forging their identity, their memory, and their future across the vast expanse of time. This is the story of Ezra, the scribe. Imagine Jerusalem not in its glory but in ruins, the magnificent temple, the spiritual heart of a nation, reduced to rubble, the city walls broken, its people scattered, exiled to Babylon for 70 years. A whole generation born and raised far from their ancestral land, speaking a foreign tongue, worshipping in the shadow of foreign gods. This was the state of affairs when Cyrus the Great of Persia, a century and a half before Esther, issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. A wave of hope, followed by the daunting reality of a devastated homeland. Decades passed. The temple was eventually rebuilt, but the spirit of the people remained fragile. They had lost their way, intermarrying with foreign peoples, in neglecting their ancient laws, their heritage fading like a forgotten dream. The grand story of their past, their covenant with the divine, was being eroded by the daily struggles of a broken present. Who would stitch it back together? Who would remind them of who they truly were and what they were meant to be? Enter Ezra, a priest, a scribe, a man described as skilled in the law of Moses. He lived in Babylon, far from the physical ruins of Jerusalem, but acutely aware of the spiritual ruins of his people. Ezra was consumed by a singular passion, to study the law of the Lord, to practice it, and to teach its statutes and rules in Israel. He was a scholar, yes, but more than that, he was an architect of memory, a builder of identity. He understood that a people without their sacred texts, without their shared stories and laws, were a people doomed to disappear, regardless of whether they had a rebuilt temple. In the 7th year of King Artaxerxes, a new Persian king, Ezra received permission to lead another group of exiles back to Jerusalem. He carried with him not gold or weapons, but something far more precious, the very scrolls of the law. He arrived in Jerusalem to find a community adrift. The people were intermarrying, neglecting the Sabbath, and had allowed the temple worship to become lax. Ezra was devastated. He tore his garment and cloak, pulled hair from his head and beard, and sat appalled. He understood that the physical rebuilding was not enough. The spiritual foundations had to be restored, brick by painstaking brick. Ezra began to read the law of Moses to the assembled people, from early morning until midday for days on end. The words, long forgotten or misunderstood, resonated with profound power. As he read, the people wept, convicted by their neglect, moved by the beauty and truth of their heritage. Ezra, alongside other Levites, explained the meaning of the law, making it clear to the people. He taught them to understand what they were hearing. This was not just a reading, it was a re-education, a spiritual revival. He instituted reforms demanding that the people separate from their foreign wives and recommit to the covenant. It was a harsh, painful demand, but Ezra believed it was essential for the survival of their distinct identity. Ezra's power was not derived from a king's scepter, nor from military might. It was the power of the word, the power of education, the power of spiritual conviction. He essentially edited, compiled, and standardized the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, shaping the very text that would become the cornerstone of Jewish life and thought for thousands of years. He ensured its preservation, its accessibility, and its centrality. He didn't just teach the law, he embedded it into the very soul of the returning community, making it the blueprint for their existence. The question we asked at the beginning was, how did 4 individuals, born into a people often dispersed and dispossessed, rise to command such immense power within such empires And what did they do with it? Esther and Mordecai saved a generation from physical annihilation. Ezra, the scribe, saved a people from spiritual oblivion. He ensured that even when empires crumbled, even when temples lay in ruins, the Jewish people would carry their most precious possession within them, their story, their laws, their identity, enshrined in the very words he meticulously preserved and taught. From the ashes of exile, Ezra didn't just rebuild a community. He rebuilt a memory, a collective consciousness that allowed a people to not just survive, but to endure, to thrive, to continue shaping the world in ways far beyond their numbers. His work laid the groundwork for the future, for the very possibility of Jewish continuity. The destruction of the First Temple, the 70 years of exile, was not the end. It was the forging of a new kind of power, the power of the book, the power of shared memory, the power of a story that refuses to die. That story, that identity still pulses today, a direct lineage from the meticulous work of a scribe thousands of years ago. What surprised you most about these stories of power and survival? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts and connecting with you.